My Mother, the Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fortuna Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. In true Alzheimer's fashion, my mother's next health scare came as suddenly as it was startling. It happened Saturday night, the beginning of my March break week, during dinner. My mother was in mid-chew of her dinner when she stopped chewing, closed her eyes, and put her head down on the table. I called her name. She was awake, but she couldn't open her eyes. She was trying to lift her head off the table, but she couldn't. So I called the ambulance and we rushed my mother to the hospital. And when they checked, they found her sugar level jump. My mother had no history of diabetes, but when we got to the hospital, it was 48. And the normal level is between 5 and 7. It's over 6 times the normal level. So she was admitted in the hospital so they could see why her insulin was going up so high and to bring it under control because she couldn't really go home with that level. We stayed in the hospital for that entire week that I was on break. The only good thing was I didn't have to go to work. And I stayed in the hospital for 2 reasons. Number one, it was COVID time. So the hospital wasn't allowing us to go back and forth, to go in and to go back, even though this was after we received the second dose of vaccination. It's still the hospital was under restriction to make sure there was no outbreak. They didn't allow me to come and go. I had to stay, and I was the only one that could stay there. None of the other family members could come in and see her. That was my first reason of staying there. My second reason of staying there is that my mother was in a ward. That means she was in a hospital room with 4 beds, including her bed. So they were all elderly in the same situation or even in a worse situation. And each nurse was responsible for 3 rooms. 12 patients, all in my mother's situation. And keep in mind, or worse, and keep in mind, my mother is not mobile. My mother cannot get up and go. She can really not feed herself as well. Even if she's putting the food in her mouth, she needs to be guided. She needs to be reminded to chew. She can't take her own medication. Somebody has to do all those basic needs for her. And I felt really, really bad for those nurses because these young women, they were all of them in that floor, at least were young women, worked 12-hour shifts, and they were the only one responsible for those 12 patients. So I decided to stay for my mother and take care of her needs, including giving her medications when the nurse brought it in, making sure when the meal was brought, I fed her, and then I monitored her insulin. Somebody was coming in to do a blood test and so on. We got there Saturday night. And by the time she was admitted and we went upstairs in the room was Sunday morning, and we stayed there until the following Thursday when the nurses and the doctors were able to bring her blood sugar level to a level where I could manage. It's still, I was given 2 insulin shots. One of them was fast acting. So I would do that during the day to make sure that it stayed in a normal level, and slow or long acting, which I would do at night. All I could think about for that entire week I was in the hospital with my mother was, imagine if my mother didn't have me there, or imagine if I had to work. Luckily, it fell on a week when I wasn't working and I could stay with her, even though I was exhausted and didn't have the break that I needed. But I was so grateful that it was time I was off. And all I could think about was, other patients that were there that didn't have family members that could sit with them all the time, because I was there, wasn't getting really good night's sleep because I was sitting on a chair the entire night. And then I was getting up all the time because the nurses are in and out checking this patient, checking that patient. If you have ever been in a hospital overnight, you know how there is really no rest. And my mother didn't really like it, but we had to stay there. And I was grateful that all her levels were brought to a manageable level, and I was able to take her home and to manage it. And now we're down to where I am checking her blood sugar level, and I'm only giving her the long acting at night. If the level is high after I give her dinner and I wait for an hour or two, then I check the level. Then I give her the long acting shot if she needs it. Some nights she doesn't need it, and some nights she does. That's what we're doing. So if I was thinking before the situation or my mother's health situation was hard to manage, now, as you can see, the issues are getting layered. First, we had the pulmonary embolism that I talked about in the last episode, where there was blood clot in her lungs. And then we had congestive heart failure. She was on blood thinner for the pulmonary embolism. And now she has to be on insulin shots to manage her blood sugar level. So it was getting layered now, and you could see the gradual progression and the sudden jump of something that are startlingly difficult as you're dealing with a loved one living with Alzheimer's. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want to also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories reconstructed from my childhood memory. Nietzsche Kane's elder finished the bean soup quicker than anybody else. He placed the bowl on the ground next to his stool. "Should we start?" he said. Timira pulled the stool closer to her father and stared ahead. She willed herself out of the village square, even though she knew every eye was on her. Timira must return to her husband. The elder listed his reasons for the suggestion. To her own home. He seemed determined to encourage her to go back to meet Kane. But Timira knew there was nothing anyone could say or do to make her go back. She was lucky to have found her way home to her family. "Do you understand?" He must have added the last part to coax Timira into accepting what he suggested. "Yes," she said. He launched into a long lecture. "A conflict between a couple must be solved between the two," he said with a smile. "Bringing out to the open only adds to the problem." He stopped here and scanned the crowd before him, watching them as they nodded in agreement. "No one here except you and your husband should know what happens between you." He was looking directly at Timira. "Do you understand?" he said again. "You explained it perfectly," she said. "And your answer?" "I'm not going back there." Nietzsche Kane's elder got up from the stool, but he didn't leave as Timira had hoped. "You do understand what I explained, do you not?" His fury seemed to grow with every word. "Yes," she said firmly so he would understand her. "But I'm not going back to him." Timira hoped he would leave her alone. He didn't. Nita Kane's elder took 2 steps toward her and loomed over her. Have you considered all I have said? He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. If you don't return, Asa will demand his dowry back. He must have saved the worst for the last. With that, he got Timira's full attention. How could that be? She held her end of the devilish bargain. But I married him, became his wife. The idea that her father would have to give the dowry back shocked her. For 6 weeks? You were married to him for 6 weeks. The elder didn't ask that in need of an answer. Timira could tell he'd done it for emphasis by his lips parted slightly, giving his dark face lines, ominous shadows, maybe to illustrate how ludicrous her thoughts and actions were. You expect a man to pay that much for 6 weeks? But nothing about the agreement specified time, she said. The time was, the elder stopped here and scanned the area around him before he continued, for you to keep his home and bear his children. The elder sounded exasperated. His face glowed with the rage that seemed to burn within him. Your father and I gave the man our words. You agreed. Does that mean anything to you? I married him, but there was nothing about having children. What do you think marrying meant? He issued a mocking laugh. Timira, the elder from her village, spoke in a consoling tone. I want you, and your father agrees to return to your home. I won't. Asa is willing to forget all of this. Nita Kane's elder pointed at the space between Timira and her father. If you agree to go back. Timira didn't respond. Her determination to reject the notion of going back shook under the realization that her father would lose more than he'd gained. But still, her resolve didn't crack deep enough to change her mind. Maybe your father will talk some sense into you. Nita Kane's elder motioned for the rest of his men to follow him. Send us a word when you make a decision. He turned around and walked out. Others, including Nita Kane, followed him. I do not know what to do, Timira said to her father and their elder. You do. Her father stared at the bean soup before him. He wasn't eating. His wooden spoon rested on the side of his full bowl. You did when you left his house. I didn't think you would have to repay everything. That was true. Timira could have claimed ignorance, but she didn't because she realized she would have left even if she knew this outcome. The dark feeling descended on her every minute she spent in Nita Kane's house flashed before her. What would come of you, of us, if I refused to go back to him? Timira asked instead. That question didn't occur to her before now. Not until Nita Kane's elder told her about the repayment. Make the right decision for you, her father said. He looked at her. His eyes held hers for a long time. Don't you worry about me or us. Timira tried to reel her father into discussing the matter, but he refused to participate. Marian and Halima showed up at her door early in the morning of the 3rd day since Nita Kane's arrival. Time to get ready, Marian announced. I'm ready, Timira said. They were there partly to help her, but Timira knew they came to have a front row seat of the showdown between Nita Kane and her. The gossip mill that began to churn at the sight of Nita Kane's arrival in the village was working full throttle. You want to sit next to your husband in a house dress? Marian sounded incredulous. Next to him? Timira was ready to sit before the elders and tell them what she wanted, but sitting next to Nita Kane was asking her too much. "He is your husband," Halima said. The woman fussed over her for the rest of that morning. They were braiding and unbraiding her hair. She let them do it as her mind drifted back to what was at stake. Her father's loss. Maybe it was better to go back. Her suffering would be more bearable than putting her father in such a predicament. But that only lasted a mere second before the thought made her nauseous. "Wear this." Marian handed Timira a white guntino and gold and blue shawl. She wore the guntino, but exchanged the shawl for one of her mother's shawls, which still smelled like her mother. "That's so ugly," Halima complained. The woman spoke about her as if she weren't there and wasn't listening to them. Timira pulled her mother's shawl around her tight. "It's too warm out there," Marian commented as they waited to take her to the village square. "The one we gave you is lighter." "Wear the one we gave you," Marian agreed with Halima. But Timira wouldn't hear of it. "It's her mother's," Timira's father said on his way out of the house. "Let her keep it." They nodded in unison. Walking between Marian and Halima, Timira thought about her decision. To go back with him was the right decision, wasn't it? "Here's your seat." Marian pointed to a chair next to Need's cane. He was already there. He was greeting and welcoming people. The 5 men Need's cane brought with him seemed too many at first. But his supporters had doubled and redoubled by the time he and Timiro settled in the middle of the square, across from the 2 elders. Did he feel outnumbered and sent a word for more? Now the entire square reeled under the weight of the crowd from both sides. The ground beneath Timiro's feet pulsed with the expectation of those who came to take in her epic fall. The battle lines were drawn. Timir took a deep breath to slow her raging heart. The memory of the horrible smell from the market to the Nietzsche cane came back and filled her lungs, corroding all her internal organs. The 2 elders, one from Timira's village and the other from Nietzsche cane's side, sat under the large orak tree, heavy with the moisture of the abundant rain they had the previous week. The thick green foliage formed shadows over them. The leaves moved side to side and up and down, swaying under the gentle breeze. The 2 elders had pale white hair on their heads and faces, as if dipped in a bowl of fresh camel milk. They looked similar in both appearance and manners. They ran their hands through the locks on their heads simultaneously and adjusted their shawls several times before tugging at the thick beards that covered most of their faces. The rest of the people, men, women, and children from both sides, formed a circle around them. There were no trees to shade Nietzsche cane and Timiro. The afternoon sun beamed down, punishing rays on their heads. Timiro slipped further into the thick shawl she'd wrapped herself in the morning. Large beads of sweat started from her head, rolling gently down her back to where her bottom met the seat. The elders spoke to each other in whispers. One nodded as the other explained something inaudible to Timiro and the rest of the crowd. The 2 took turns like that for a long while before the elder from Timiro's village turned to Nietzsche cane and Timiro. "Do you see these 2 fingers?" His eyes wide, his brows scrunched together. "These," he wiggled them back and forth. Timiro nodded at the same time Nietzsche cane did. "Speak to it so I can hear you, so others can hear you." "Yes," Nietzsche cane said. "Yes," Timiro did the same. "This is the cursed finger." He folded his index finger, leaving the middle one standing alone, isolated like what it represented. If you take this, you get what you want. He stopped and took a long and deliberate breath. That means you chose the cursed finger. You place yourself outside our counsel and comfort. His gaze rested on the crowd before returning to Timiro and Nitze. This is the blessing finger. He wagged his index finger back and forth, perhaps to show the joy that comes with taking that one. If you pick this one, you do what we say. He watched people in the square. You are with us and among us. The silence over the crowd was deafening. May Allah guide you to the right path. He waited for a long minute. The husband goes first, he announced finally. Timira bent her head so far down that her chin touched her chest. She prayed long and hard for Nitze to take the index finger, to go along what they wanted. Her eyes closed. She continued to pray until the congratulatory ululation from the woman erupted. The sound of her tongues moving to the rhythm of their joy pulled her out of her prayer. She looked up and saw Nitze holding the index finger. His face shone with beautiful smile that shimmered under the bright sun. Timiro, the elder's tone was gentler than the last time when she told him she wanted the hearing to go ahead. It's your turn. She got up. Her body felt light. Air bubbles filled between the soles of her shoes and the ground beneath them. She floated, her feet never touching the ground. The distance between the elder's extended hand and her seat was less than 10 feet apart. But to Timiro, it felt like she was covering miles in the distance. She wanted to run to get there fast. Her hand shook as she lifted it, and before she brought it down and clutched the middle finger, the cursed digit, the elder tugged at his hand to pull it out of Timiro's grip. She held on tight before she lifted her hand, the elder's finger within it for all to see. A loud and unanimous gasp rang throughout the crowd. What did she do? Someone in the back asked. She chose the curse, another person responded. There is no God but Allah, yet another person yelled. Soon, one person's shocked comment followed another. It was hard to tell who said what, but Timiro didn't care what they said or thought. She finally freed herself from Nitze, and that's all that mattered. She dropped the elder's hand, lifted her head, and faced the crowd. The quietness that started at the front quickly moved through. Standing in the middle, all eyes were on her, waiting. Even if the ground beneath me opens and swallows me whole. She made eye contact with people before her. I wouldn't go with him. She waited for a long minute. I would rather die right now, right here, than be with him for one more day. She turned around and walked out. Her father followed her. My mother, the person and the patient, can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.